Excellent. Good morning, everyone. This is Carrie McCann-Botel. You may be able to see me if you're joined on your computer. Thanks so much for joining us. We are thrilled to continue our conversation today that many of you perhaps started with us at the Connect conference in the fall of last year. Stacy Van Gorp joined us for a conversation that was titled 5 Lessons from Our First 15 Years Through the County Endowment Fund Program, which, as you know, is the same time that most of our community foundations across the state began their work. So as part of that reflection, one of her lessons was really thinking about how we interact with our nonprofit partners who are applying for our grants and how we're building strong relationships with the organizations that we're funding, our nonprofit grantees. And the lesson here is to treat those grantees and nonprofit partners the same way that we treat the donors that we meet with in our communities. So this question here to get us started is a good way to let everyone know who all is on the webinar this morning. So I'll just read through a few of the responses of the 1 or 2 words that people have shared here. One response was setting up a meeting to learn more. The favorite response of mine so far is from Molly in Guttenberg. Her response was send the donor to MJ, who many of you know in our network and does a fantastic job building partnerships with donors in Northeast Iowa. Another response of passing the donor contact information and information onto another staff member at the host community foundation. If the person happens to be newer to the board, it might be nice to make that handoff to someone who has lots of experience in handling those calls and conversations. Invite them to meet, saying, tell me more. Asking if there's someone on the development staff who can help with more information. And saying, I'd love to connect them with the charitable giving team. And I think those are the responses we have so far. Oh, and also, that's great news. I would love to help you out and get you the information. I think that's probably our most comprehensive response so far. So thanks for joining in our welcome activity. And I am thrilled to turn things over to Stacy Van Gorp. Many of you have met her and worked closely with her in our Iowa Community Foundations Initiative Network. And she has lots to share with us this morning. And we also have 4 peers from across the state who are going to reflect on some of the practices that they've integrated into their grant making process as well. So you'll hear from several folks this morning. Feel free to use the chat box to enter any questions. And we'll also be using a polling feature on Zoom. So Stacy will share when those prompts will come up. And it should be pretty intuitive how to respond to those, but please feel free to chat me if you have any questions on how to navigate the technology. So Stacy, I will let you take it from here.
All right. I'm so glad to be back with you today. It was fun to see so many of you at Connect. And I think if you were there or if you know me, you know that I have a lot of enthusiasm for community-based philanthropy. I think place-based philanthropy, community foundations, community foundation affiliates, private foundations that have a place-based approach, I think are some of the most important ways that we change our community. And I believe that because you're on the ground level. You know what people need in your community. You have a sense of who to ask if you're not sure what they need. You have a sense of sort of what wind is in your sails and what might be difficult. So I have just a strong belief in the power of community philanthropy and the power of both how that money goes out the door that we're going to talk about today in terms of grant making, but also in the power of helping donors realize their dreams. And I love that part of community foundations. And so I'm so happy that we can start with this idea about how our values cross over in those 2 settings. So just a little bit about this scenario. So this is a picture of my husband. When I was working on the presentation, I was like, who would give me permission to use their picture? So this is my husband, and he's very interested in recreation. He's the recreation director at UNI. So this is not a this is not something that he wouldn't be interested in. I think that he's always thinking about how to change his community. And so a lot of people walking around in your community like Chris, or like other friends and colleagues that are waking up this morning thinking, gosh, I wonder how I could help my community. So 1 or 2 words about how I would respond to the call. I would respond to the call and say, let me see if it's going to let me advance. I would say yes. So I was a fundraiser for a long time before I was a grant maker. And, you always start with the donor by saying, yes, how can we make that happen? How can we, if there's a no somewhere in the process, how do we help to soften that no? How do we help to be flexible? How do we really start with this idea of yes? And so that I think is a lot about our approach. So that's a common approach we use with donors, but we don't always think of that in terms of our role with grant seekers. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. How might we say yes to more of the ways that grant seekers want to engage in their community? It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to say yes to more grants. It might not mean that you approve more applications, but it might mean the way that we work with people has more of that orientation. So we'll walk this through some of these ideas, and then we're going to turn it over to your colleagues who are doing this work in the real world and can give you some real world advice. And then if you have questions along the way, as Carrie said, put them in the chat. And then if we have time at the end, we'll try to open up some microphones and have people ask their questions as well. So the principle here, or the value, is to create a high impact foundation. Treat your grant seekers as well as you treat your donors. So when I was with you in the fall, we were thinking about this idea of the first 15 years as the first chapter of community foundations, and really thinking of this next 10 years or 15 years as the second chapter. So my summary of your first chapter is that it's been amazing. You've created an infrastructure in Iowa where people can make their charitable dreams come true and where people can change their communities. And you've done that through diligence and hard work and practices. And now I think a lot of us look at our communities and think, we do that really well, but I want as much impact as I can get. I really want to be able to use this tool to make the biggest difference possible. So I think your second chapter might be around this idea of high impact. So the principle we're talking about today, we think, is really related to high impact. It's sort of not about right and wrong, but moving from what we do exceptionally well as the basics to thinking about how might we tweak those basics to be able to create a lot of impact. So we think that this works through alignment. So when you're working to be a high impact grant maker, you have to align your values, your principles, and your practices. So we're starting with this value today. This is a high impact value. Treat your grant seekers as well as you treat your donors. So if donors fuel your community through money, grant seekers fuel your community through work, effort, attention, right? So we all bring different assets to our community. Some of us can contribute money. Some of us are driving change and helping people in our communities. So I think this idea of this value is, how do we get the most from all of the people trying to help our community? And how do we have a value that says when people are trying to work and help our community and need a grant to do that, their effort will really help us be more high impact. So that's the big banner. Our value is that everybody brings something different to the table, and we need to treat all of those people in similar ways. So I'm going to talk about 5 principles of being a high impact grant maker, and then I'm going to ask Nicole to weigh in on some of the ways that they've done this. So we're going from values to principles to practices. So we'll spend most of our time on practices today, like very practical things, but we want to frame it through this idea of principles, because there's probably 1,000 practices that could work with these principles. We're going to show you 5. But so we want to give you the principles first, because then your creative minds can work on how else you could do that. So principle number 1 is build relationships with grant seekers. So in all of those scenarios when you were responding to your potential donor, it was like, let's meet, tell me more. I want to learn about what you really want to do. And this is the same approach for high impact with grant seekers, right? If somebody's interested in applying for a grant, or they're doing something interesting in the community as a grant seeker, you want to talk to them, you want to know them, you want to understand what motivates them. It's okay to have relationships with your your grant seekers. I think sometimes we worry about being fair, and I absolutely believe that we need to worry about being fair. But being honest in a relationship of saying, I want to learn more about what you're working on. I can't make the decision all by myself, and I can't give you an answer, is a very honest way. But without that relationship, we might fail to really understand what somebody's working on, just as we might fail to understand what the donor really wants. So if you don't meet with Chris, you might not know it's outdoor recreation he's really interested in, right? If you just had him sort of submit something on paper, think of the things you could miss. So this idea of relationship is not opposite of fairness, right? You have to be thoughtful about it and name what your limits are, but getting to know people and understanding what they're working on can help with high impact. Being considerate of the grant seeker's time. So I was a grant seeker before I was a grant maker, so I probably am a little bit passionate about this topic. I think that we often think of our donors' time and we think we'll be flexible, we try to be as efficient as possible, like schedule it perfectly to work for the donor. But when it comes to the grant seekers, we're like, oh yeah, let's make that due on New Year's Day. I mean, people don't have anything else going on that day. Or we might ask them to do something that takes them 20 hours of work for getting $1,000 or $5,000. That is not considerate of their time. That 20 hours that we take applying for a grant is 20 hours we can't help, feeding people who need food in your community, or doing an after-school program, or running an arts event. So really thinking about how much time can we use. At the McElroy Trust, some of you know we did some experiments on this, and I'll talk about them a little bit later. Honor the grant seeker's wishes and needs. We often design our processes thinking about what we need as funders, and I was a funder, and this is a mistake that I made, and I can tell you about all those things. But the process by which we bring information into our foundation really needs to focus on what that person needs to do their best to help the community. So if they need operating support, if they need to be able to, work in 2 counties rather than 1, like these are all things that don't fit very well in our guidelines, right? But they're the people doing the work. So how do we find a path to yes about how they know that community change will help? Be flexible with grant seekers, again, working in that way. Somebody has an emergency request to be able to keep a child care center open in your community. I bet you want that child care center open. How can we be more flexible with grant seekers like we would with donors, right? If a donor wants to do something unusual, we find ways to say yes. So how can we find ways to say yes when it comes to community impact and grant seeking? And then finally, treat grant seekers as the experts. There's somebody in your community waking up today and going to work all day long with kids, or going to work all day long with seniors, or going to work all day long with people who are struggling financially. They know a lot more about that than I do. When I woke up today, I thought about what I need to do to help you. And I know some about those things, but there are people that really know a lot more about what's happening in your community than I might. And so when you're hearing from them, think of them as the expert, just like the donor who said he was interested in recreation. You'd treat him as the expert. And so these are some of the principles that we're talking about. I'm going to turn it over to Nicole, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to turn those into practice. And after Nicole, Carrie, if you have any questions you want us to address, we'll pause then. All right, Nicole, I'm going to put myself on mute so we can hear you clearly.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. So I'm sorry, my laptop is on the fritz, so I don't have a camera or a microphone, so I'm talking to you through my phone. So Carrie had asked me to talk about some of the things that we instituted after we were part of the cohort. And what the cohort did for me is it gave me permission to do some investigation on what other people are doing and really change up a grant program that we had going on for about 10 years. And it was run the same, it had been run when it was established. And so we weren't doing much around site visits. And so I talked to some of my peers in the cohort, and we started doing site visits, but we decided that 40 site visits was too cumbersome. And we decided to do kind of a sampling of site visits each year. And if we met with the fire department in Brooklyn one year, we probably wouldn't meet with them in the next year, and we try and go to a different group. So that was one of the things that I remember somebody saying is, you don't have to go visit every organization that you fund. That would be very cumbersome with your time, and if you can get out and do that, that's great. So that was one of the learnings that we instituted. And then the other thing was that all of our processes were created with our needs basically in mind. And so through the cohort, and hopefully everybody knows, the cohort is a group that came together to look at grant making and how we can be more responsive to grantees. So after that fact, I tried to look at all of the things through the eyes of the grant seeker or the grantee. And we made changes in our application. We made changes, as I said, in our site visit process. We decided not to ask for receipts anymore. Just several things that hopefully made the entire process much more user-friendly. We tried to be very accessible, and we also instituted, so we would get grants back that might have been missing a copy of their IRS status or maybe the W-9. So instead of completely rejecting those applications because they came in, right at the deadline, we created a soft deadline on a Wednesday, and our hard deadline was Friday. And so that gave us a couple days to reach out to people. And as far as anybody knows, the deadline was Wednesday, but it gave us a few days, and then we weren't feeling like we were, being preferential to some because they still needed to get information in. So that's another thing, and it has worked so well. I mean, we have very little problem really getting the documents that we need the first time around, but if we do, people are very responsive and they get them to us before that hard deadline a couple days later. So I think those are some. Does somebody have any questions?
Yeah, this is Stacy. Nicole, thank
Hi
you.
there.
We really
Yeah.
appreciate you going first, and also just want to congratulate you on the good work you've done in shifting. It's hard to change after 10 years, so just really admire you for that. Could you just say a few words about what became different once you shifted the practices or you went on the site visits? So maybe an example of something you learned when you went on the site visits, or something that might have shifted in your relationship when you started to change practices, like sort of like, what's the return for making this change?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like people were surprised, grantees were surprised, and I feel like we gained their trust. I feel like, the site visits when we did go weren't, so with another program I had done site visits that felt more punitive. And so I didn't want that for this program. And it's more of a conversation. And I think that was really surprising to some of the grantees because they maybe were used to the more punitive type of site visit. So I feel like we've developed a relationship. They'll call, they'll email, they keep me informed about changes to the grant application so that we can be responsive if somebody needs an extension, or sometimes people have to give money back because they just can't do the project the way they thought. And we try to be flexible with that so that they can use it if they've got another way of doing or another project to use the money on. So I think it's definitely created a level of trust. That's the big thing. And hopefully they see me as more accessible. So we're talking. Oh, I know. Another thing I wanted to mention too. Sorry. We also, we often get requests for money outside of our regular county endowment granting period. So we set aside $10,000 and we do a very quick turnaround, kind of we call it instant impact, but it's very quick, and it's up to $1,000, and we've had a great response from that too. So.
Well, I love these stories, Nicole. Thank you so much for sharing those. Just a couple of themes to pick up, and then Carrie will take a couple questions. I think one is, this idea about a site visit or relationship building, not as a compliance function, right? You're not going there to look over their shoulder and make sure they're not committing fraud, right? Fraud is very rare in our sector, and a lot of our systems are sort of set up to protect against that. And so I think if you take this principle of thinking, how would we work with a donor, right? We would go meet with a donor 6 months after they made a gift and say to them, how do you think it's going? So that's almost the same approach with the grant seeker. Like, tell me, how is this going? So I really like the way that story highlights those principles. And then I love the way that you added a different kind of process that could respond to some of these things. So when we're talking about this later, we're not suggesting you just throw out everything you've ever done, right? That there's no rules, that there's no process. What we're saying is, how are there ways that you can flex and change a little bit that would be more in line with this so that you can get these payoffs? And I also, I think keeping in mind, we're not saying go and ask grant seekers for money. That's not what we're saying. But in a smaller community, the way that you interact with your grant seekers is probably only 1 degree of separation from your donors, right? Your grant seekers know your donors know your grant seekers, probably some of them are all the same people. So I think when you're building trust with a grant seeker, that has a dividend that pays off with your donors. So I can't show you a specific, sort of cause and effect, but I think that you all probably have stories where that's been true. So thank you, Nicole, for sharing. We're going to take a couple of questions, Carrie.
Sure. Yes. I might just add, I think one of Nicole's stories illustrated one of my key learnings in the cohort, and that is I'm very type A rule follower as my personality. And having sort of those hard and fast rules about process and deadline and attachments and all of those things sometimes just is not a very equitable way to do grant making, especially for organizations that are grassroots. Maybe they're run by an entire volunteer board, don't have any paid staff, which is many of the organizations that we're funding, especially in our affiliate counties. So just encourage you to really challenge some of those rules and think about where you can create flexibility. And it sounds like Nicole had a good suggestion for a solution on that, in a way to reach out and offer a couple extra days for folks to collect that information if they missed it the first time around. So thanks for sharing that, Nicole, and all of your other storytelling. We really appreciate it. I did have a question from Tom at the Community Foundation of Northeast Iowa. He is referencing a blog post that was shared yesterday. Oh. Many of you may follow Vule's blog, Nonprofit AF. I will be happy to share the link to that and the follow-up resources. And Vu's post yesterday was really about the importance of funders building relationships with organizations as opposed to one specific person at an organization. So Tom is just asking, Stacy, if you have any recommendations on how to strengthen that relationship with the agency or the organization as opposed to a specific person at that organization.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tom. I feel like you could probably answer this question just as well as I could. But, I think one of the things is to think about when you're asking for a meeting, saying like, hey, can we get together? I think going to the place where the agency lives is really a good way to do that, because then you can see it, but you're also seen. I think encouraging the person you're meeting with to invite other people to the meeting, like, would one of your board members be willing to come? Or do you have sort of a second in charge person that I could also meet with? Again, it's, I think, not a one size fits all recommendation. So I wouldn't say when you go on a site visit, make a rule, there always has to be 2 people there. And I'm sure that's not what Tom would suggest either. But I think any way that you could encourage that, I think is really important. And I think it's also I think it's also a principle about kind of equity and fairness. So of course, in smaller places, like we're often friends with the people that run these organizations. One of my college roommates ran one of the organizations who would frequently ask for funds from the trust. So I think it's important that it's not seen as Stacy will give to her, right? That it has to be about organization. So if you're also worried about that, bring someone else from your organization. So Cindy might have a board member. Cindy, I can see you on your picture. So Cindy might have a board member that could go on the site visit too, or a member of the grants committee. And I know some of you use those processes. So I love that suggestion and the reminder. And I didn't see Vu's post yesterday, but I'll be sure to check it out. That's always a must read for me. So I think we'll go ahead and go on to the next set. Carrie, or is there one more? Okay.
Just one more suggestion, a couple more suggestions. Tam just shared that she likes to attend the fundraising events that her grantees host. So that's another good way to expose yourself to, probably the entire staff and board of that organization. The other thing I would share, a practice that we used at a foundation I worked at in Indianapolis, was just to send a quick recap email following site visits and phone conversations. So you're creating sort of a paper trail, if you will, of that relationship. And then if an organization did have turnover in their staff, we could send them that file and they could quickly read it and sort of see how the relationship had evolved. So just another simple thing you could be doing in sort of a paper trail fashion.
Yeah, I love that idea, Tam, as well, because it doesn't create extra work for the organization, which sometimes people really go out of their way to create a big production when you come. So whatever you can tell them to say, like, you don't have to do a bunch of extra stuff. I just want to come over. I think that's important. We also had a practice at the trust that we wrote just a paragraph about each site visit that we shared with our board. So it was just part of what we called due diligence. And so it was just a paragraph that we would say, like, oh, we went to visit this place and this was really interesting and this is what they're working on. It wasn't like a recommendation or funding or something that had to happen, but that has also been very helpful in that similar way. And it keeps your board in the loop of what you're doing if you're a paid staff member, or sort of like what's going on. It can pave the way for something in the future as well when there's only one person having the experience. All right, we're going to go along. I'm going to try to be mindful of time. We're going to do a poll. I know it's going to work perfectly. I told folks yesterday I had a little technical glitch in the meeting I was at, so I'm sure we're not going to have them today. I've gotten them all out of the way. So poll 1. In just a minute, you're going to actually be able to click on something, but I'm going to tell you the poll question first. So now we're moving into practices. So Nicole helped us see principles and how they applied them to practices. Now we're going to talk about particular practices. So we'd love to hear from you. What kind of limits do you place on how a grant can be used? So you might not have any rules about this. That would be choice A. You might say you can't use it for general operating support, or you can't use it for salaries, or you can't use it for existing programs, or you can't use it for capital, or maybe there's an other. And so these are your choices. So you can pick as many as apply to you, but you probably can't pick A and then B, C, and D, right? So A is that you don't have any limits. So if you pick A, probably can't pick the rest, but you may pick B, C, D, E. You might have lots of limits. So Ellie's going to launch the poll. So go ahead and click on what applies to you. You can click on as many. Oh, I see people are clicking. Thank you. Thanks. Give it a, I can see them coming in. And let's give it another 10 seconds or so. When I kind of see a lull, I'll end polling. All right, going once, going twice. All right, last call. I'm going to hit end polling, right, Ellie? And now I'm going to share results. Can you see the results, Carrie? Okay, great. I knew it would work. So it looks like there are 3 of you on the call that don't have any limits. It looks like there are 8 that say you can't use it for general operations, 9 that can't use it for salary, just 1 that's prohibiting use for existing program, 4 of you about other capital expenses, and then there's some other rules about how the money can be used. And I'm guessing those might be things like the money can't go to individuals, can't go to political groups for lobbying or something like that, which are in the IRS regulations, depending on your type of foundation. So I'm going to stop sharing the results and we'll talk about these practices a little bit. We're going to do 2 of these polls and talk about 2 practices, and then we'll have another in real life example. All right, so I'm going to close that. One of the things we want to talk about is about high impact grant making. And so I think this is a place where, again, we're not saying, I'm going to have to make that smaller. This isn't a place where we're saying this is wrong and right. We're saying that one of the ways you can move from doing really good grant making to high impact grant making is thinking about opening up grant uses. So we've put these all in terms of do this, not that. So we would recommend, we being Stacy, that you consider giving operating support, program support, capital support, and any kind of support that will make your community better that's within the legal limits. And everything that we've listed there is certainly within the legal limits. And we believe that because we think that in any community, you need really different things. In some communities, we need agencies to keep doing what they're doing well. At the McElroy Trust, we were trying to work to help young people. So, giving operating support to organizations that helped young people day in and day out was a really great investment for the health and well-being of our community. We wanted that resource to exist. We didn't want to make somebody go create a new resource. We knew we had that resource and we wanted to support it. So we think not limiting the use of grants to new projects, and stopping this sort of, I think there's a word missing there, sorry. The idea of giving operating support, I think, can be a little bit scary for people. People tend to feel more comfortable giving project grants. But the reason operating support is so important is because organizations can then adapt to what they need to do to help the people on the ground. So let's say something changes about young people in your community. If you've given an operating support grant, you can trust that that organization is going to shift to meet those changes. Let's say you give a program support grant, but then maybe the program isn't well enrolled, or there's a different need that they want to meet that becomes more important. All of a sudden, they might have money that isn't able to meet a need. So operating support, giving grants for operating support, and giving grants for salaries are both practices that keep organizations healthy and sustainable, and would really encourage you to think about making that available to people, making that available to organizations. We also think it makes your community change more sustainable. When you only give money to start new things or to help projects, it's like a donut effect. So if you imagine, an organization as a circle, and a strong organization has a nice solid circle. When we only fund either projects or new projects, or we won't fund salaries, we're basically pulling that organization to do either more and more things or doing new things, and we're not filling that middle. So then the things that made that organization strong don't have the support they need. And we know organizations need great leaders. Sometimes they need, a lot of them need really great staff. They need buildings or space. And so when you say you can't use the money for that, you're sort of creating a hole in a donut. You're taking something that might be solid and pulling it out at the edges and creating a hole there. So that's why we get worried when funders aren't funding the core, which would be operating support. So we'll pause in a little bit. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I would just share with the county endowment fund dollars, there really is a lot of flexibility with how those funds can be invested. So, other funders in your community might have restrictions that they have to adhere to and how their funds can be awarded to nonprofits, but the county endowment fund really allows a lot of flexibility. So really encourage you to think about providing that operating support directly to organizations, because some other funders in your community may not be able to do that. So thinking about the unique gaps that you can fill in your community in terms of financing your nonprofits would just be something I'd share you have the flexibility to do with the county endowment fund program dollars.
Thank you. That's a great reminder, right? This is like the kind of assets that you have to use in your community are amazing, right? This sort of level of flexibility that you can both sustain what a community needs in terms of strengthening itself and to help its imagination grow. That's a pretty special mix. And I think Carrie has a good point that other funders might not have that available to them or might not have the broad range. So for example, at the McElroy Trust, we weren't able to do anything unless it had something to do with young people, because that was what McElroy said in his will. You don't have that kind of limit. You have just a few limits. So we want to encourage you to use that flexibility you have. Thanks, Carrie. We're going to do poll number 2, and then we'll have an in real life example. So poll number 2, what kind of limits do you use on the size of grants that can be requested? So no limit, so you don't say there's a maximum grant. Maybe you have a $5,000 maximum, 10,000, 25, or other. And so Ellie's going to launch the poll. Please go ahead and weigh in on the poll. Thank you, everybody, for weighing in. All right, going once, going twice. Going to end polling and share the results. All right, so it looks like 8 out of 18, so more than half of you have no limits. Well, it's not quite half, I guess, have no limits on the amount of funds that can be requested. And so again, we're working in this value system that says try to say yes, right? So if a donor was coming to you and they said, I want to make this gift, you wouldn't say like, that's too much. I know that we have some little limits on how small the gift can be, and I also know you've been creative about how to manage those, right? And so that's a place you can see where the opposite premise has worked as well. So it looks like there's one foundation with a $5,000 limit, 5 with a $10,000 limit, 1 with a $25,000 limit, and then an assortment in that other category. So I'm going to stop share results and we'll talk about this, and then I'll turn it over in just a moment to an in real life example. So let me close this so you can see the text. So we think in high impact grant making, not having a maximum really makes sense. And that's because, if you say we can only give a grant for $10,000, that really limits the imagination. And sometimes the project's bigger than that. And sometimes you might want to make one really big bet on a project instead of making 10 small bets. Now that's a matter of strategy at your organization. And so I always want you to consider, should our strategy be a few bigger things or lots of smaller things? But that's a strategic decision, not a decision that should be governed by a rule. So if you have a strategic plan and you're thinking of what kind of impact are we trying to make, that might tell you we need to be able to make a few bigger grants. But if you have this rule sitting over here in your grant making that says nothing more than $10,000, you're not going to be able to achieve that kind of impact that you're looking for. And I'm not saying that every big dollar grant is high impact or every small dollar grant is lower impact. I don't believe that. I think impact comes in all shapes and sizes, which is why I don't think having a maximum always serves you well when you're reaching for impact. So we'd recommend stop limiting the size of your grant. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't tell people how much you have to give. We want you to be transparent, saying this year we have $150,000 in grant making. People deserve to know how many resources there are available, but they also know then how much they should be thinking about applying for. You can give them information by saying, we have about $150,000 this year. On average, our grants are about $12,000, but we don't have a limit on what you can ask for. So we want you to be transparent, but you don't necessarily have to make that transparency in the form of a rule. You could say our past practice looks like this so that people have the information, because we also believe in giving people a lot of information. So these two ideas coupled together are don't put a lid on the size and don't put a lid on the type are the two ideas that we're thinking about. And I'm going to turn it over to Tam and Rebecca Murphy to talk a little bit about how they've seen this play out. And I'm not sure who's going first, so I'll leave it to the two of you as I put myself on mute.
I think Rebecca's going first, so I've unmuted you, Rebecca.
Alrighty, perfect. Thank you, Carrie and Stacy. So I'm going to share about our tidal wave grant making, which is the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines strategy to award less grants for higher dollar amounts to address our community needs. So our grant making started out as being more responsive to the needs of our local organizations and awarding more grants at smaller amounts. But we got to the point where our grant making committee and our board recognized two things. One, that we had limited funding, and two, that there were significant issues our community was facing. So by looking at community needs rather than the individual needs of our local organizations, they decided that there was a greater opportunity for impact by being more strategic for our grant making and doing those lesser amount of grants for higher dollar amounts. And through this all, they've kind of kept the end goal of improving the quality of life in mind as really what they're trying to achieve with our grant making. So this is when we started using the term tidal wave grant making, because we don't want to just create ripples. We really want to push projects forward in our community as a leader. So tidal wave grant making can really be broken down into kind of three layers. First is the impact of our funding on the project. Next is the impact of that project on the community issues. And finally, the impact of the changes to that issue on the community. So breaking it down in that way has really helped our grant making committee kind of talk about what tidal wave grant making really means. And that committee actually has an annual retreat to define what tidal wave grant making means. And their conversation and our grant making priorities are really based on what our community has already said about what our community issues and needs are. And we look at a variety of different community reports to gather that information. So using these reports, we're able to fund the issues that have already been identified by our community, rather than saying we, the Community Foundation, think this is the issue area. We really rely on those reports to do exactly what the community is already telling us. So we award 4 to 8 grants per year, and there is no minimum or maximum, but we typically don't award smaller amounts than $25,000. Our sweet spot where we award a lot is right around $100,000, and then the most we've awarded is $250,000. So I'll just end with an example. We were the first foundation to invest in centralized intake to address homelessness in our community, and we kind of did a 3-year grant, $150,000 over 3 years. And the impact of that was not just on the organization, but it has made huge strides in how homelessness is addressed here in our community. It's provided data around homelessness, the ability for them to leverage federal funding because of our funding. And again, it's just really improved how the homeless are served in our community. So we're really looking at addressing community needs and issues through our tidal wave grant making.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yeah.
I have one question. Could you share just a couple examples of some of the community reports you use, just to give people an idea of where they might look for some of that data and research?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all on our website, and I apologize. We use 16 different reports, and I am not sure what the title of any of them are, but I would be happy to share that information with Carrie, and hopefully you can get it out to everyone on this webinar today.
I can also put that in the links for you if you'd like. This is Brianne Sanchez.
Yeah, that would be great. If you'd like to share it in the chat, Brianne, go ahead and we'll get it out with the follow-up resources. I also really love, Rebecca, the example of the multi-year grant. If you have anything else to add as a funder, how that has been an effective strategy, or Stacy, if you might want to talk to that point a little bit as well.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, I think we found that to be a really effective strategy to make sure that we're providing kind of ongoing support and long-term support. It's more than just here's your one grant, you're one and done, but really providing that ongoing support to see a project through. Maybe it's not going to be completed in phase one. It needs that continued support through a number of years, and being able to do that has been really important for us, I think.
I would say to the comment about looking at community-based data, you might be thinking, well, she's in Des Moines, so that's why they have 16 reports. But almost every county in the state has somebody who's already collecting data and creating a report. Sometimes it might be regional. So for example, Early Childhood Iowa, they've created those reports. Iowa Women's Foundation has created some reports for the whole state. You know, your regional COG is often creating reports for you. If you're covered by a United Way region, if there's a hospital in serving your region, they're all doing community health needs assessments. So I love the idea that you don't necessarily have to go out and figure it all out, right? You can go and talk to folks who've already done the research and have them help you understand what might be important for this big impact. Tam, do you want to tell us more about Hardin County and
Sure.
the tidal wave grants?
Good morning. The tidal wave grant was an opportunity that Joe and Rebecca had offered to us, and it's something also that we got from our strategic planning that Stacy had facilitated for us in 2017. And so we started that in 2017, and in our grant guidelines, we offer the opportunity for nonprofits, and we do put a cap on it of $25,000. But if they want to apply for a tidal wave grant, we ask them to come to one of our board meetings, and that is in October or November it's right after we get the allocation from the state. And so we offer them to come and talk about their grant that they want us to fund, and we do ask that it impacts a large portion of Hardin County. That's one of our criteria for it. And in 2017, we had the Iowa River Trail from Hardin County come to us and ask for the $25,000, and that's a multi-million-dollar project. But it was really interesting because then they offered for our board to get on little ATVs and go over the trail. And I don't like heights, and we have lots of bridges on this trail, and they're a little rickety. But we did go. We had several board members that went on the trail and just to see what they're going to be doing. And then we didn't have any applications in 18, and in 19 we had 2 applications, one from the Iowa River Trail again, and then one from the Hanson Family Hospital. And the trail one was to rehab one of the bridges, and then the hospital asked for an e-care telemedicine. And so that was really very interesting to be able to fund those projects. And like I said, when the hospital had an open house, I offered for our board members to go. I really wanted them to see the hospital in action and how they're using our money. And so we did have a couple board members attend, and so did I. And now this year, we have a tidal wave grant to our Churchwomen United of Iowa Falls, their thrift store. These ladies have been operating in a very small, kind of condensed building, and it's just so exciting. They could raise $4,000 to $5,000 a weekend. They're only open from 10 to 4 on Friday and Saturday. And so they give back to the community. So they had an opportunity to buy a new building. And so they did massive fundraising and raised $400,000 for this new building. And they're asking for us to help them with the concrete outside this building. And I kind of think about, how much impact does that really have? But I'm really learning from you folks that it's the long range and how we can help the people in our communities. So I really do appreciate being on this call. And one more thing, can I share? Can you see this?
Yes.
It's a yard sign, and I got this idea off of your site, Carrie. I think that came from you, and somebody did it in black and white, and I thought, no, I'm going to do it in color. And this has really been great because then they'll put it on, they've had it out on their yards for the whole year. And so we'll do this again this year. So it was kind of a last minute thing that I offered to the board last year. and they bid on it. And I think it's really an exciting thing to really show off what we're doing.
And
That's
Tam,
awesome, Tam. Thank you.
and just to be clear, the signs are going to the grantee organizations?
Yes.
Yeah.
And we award those at our award night with
Oh,
their
fun.
check.
Yeah, nice. So I love all of those examples, and I really like the way that you point out that the tidal wave grants, well, it might move some money out of your regular distribution, that you're able to use sort of a different set of discernment. So you're not trying to necessarily compare a $25,000 grant to a $1,000 grant. And I think Nicole's example earlier about the smaller grants was similar. So I think this is an idea that if, when we're presenting these things about like having fewer rules or having bigger limits, you know, you can craft a separate process. Now, we don't want you to have too many processes because we don't think that's really great for grant seekers, right? So you could integrate these into your existing process, or maybe you need a special way. And I think that's also a good way with advisory boards, like try it this way. And eventually people might say, why don't we do that with all our grants? Why don't we get rid of the limits for all of those? So I think those were great examples. I also love the way that when the stakes get higher in terms of the size of the grant, that you're giving your board face-to-face opportunities, because I think a lot of times it's very difficult to put your name on a big check when it's easier on a $1,500 grant, but to say yes to a big opportunity, which means you're saying no to other ones, can be more difficult. So I love the way that you're giving them a chance to get face to face. It does all of the principles we talked about, but I think it also makes it easier to say yes. Right? It gives people a real sense, or it can give you the judgment that this isn't the right time for this project as well. All right, Carrie, anything to add? All right, we're going to go on. I could keep going all day on that, Tam. I love that example. Thank you very much. And thank you, Rebecca, for starting us off on that journey. We're going to do 2 more polls, and then we're going to turn it over to Shannon to close us out today. So how many rules or guidelines do you have for potential applicants? So how many things, when they're reading on your list, how many things do you say you can't apply if you're this, you can't apply if you're that, you can't apply if you're this? So would you go ahead and launch the poll, Ellie? All right. I saw Carrie laugh at the I lost count. Couple more coming in maybe? All right, we're going to end polling, and then we can share results, which I think you could see all along because you're looking at my screen. So it looks like 3 of you have 2 or fewer rules. That's the Stacy camp of grant making. I love that when there aren't very many rules. 4 of you have 3 or 4. It looks like the big group of you, 6 of you have 5 or 6. A few of you in that 6 to 10, and at least one of you saying, I've lost count. And so we want to just talk about this idea of how many rules. Again, you know, I think when you're getting started, it's really important to have some rules, right? Just to help people understand when you're doing. Now that you've been in this for a little bit longer, we'd like you to think, do I really need all of those rules? So do this, aim for 3 or fewer rules. And by law, I think there's often some confusion about this, and I expect that Carrie will send you a document afterwards about what's legally required in terms of rules. But for most of us, the priority rule is that you have to be a 501c3 or a government entity, and even those have some asterisks. So the rest of the rules are the ones that we've really created for ourselves. And so I want to really push you to think, do we really need these as rules? And we think that that, again, limits imagination. It can limit the kinds of changes you're making. And I know why we like rules, because it's hard to tell people no. And it's often easier to point at the rule and say the rule said no, instead of saying our committee met and we looked at 20 grants and we funded 10 of them, and these 10 we didn't fund. It sometimes feels better to be able to say it was the rule instead of our judgment. But here's the thing, I think that you have good judgment, right? I think that you can discern that, and relying on the rule to make the choice for you can limit what can happen in your community. So that last one is try not to just make 17 rules so you never have to say no. Try to have fewer rules. It won't mean you don't have to say no. You will have to say no now and then, but you'll be able to say no based on things like, there are a lot of important needs right now. We can't fund them all. And so we're picking to fund this need over this need, right? That's better than saying, having kind of an arbitrary rule about we don't fund X or Y, when maybe X or Y is really what your community needs. So this is what we're thinking about in terms of guidelines and rules. We're going to do another poll. How many questions are on your application? 2 or less, 3 or 4, 5 or 6, 6 to 10. I've lost count. Ellie, could you launch the poll? All right, we're going to end polling. Oh, I hope I got everybody. I'm sorry if I cut you off too soon. So it looks like nobody's in that 2 or less. That makes sense to me. One of you is in the 3 or 4, a whole bunch of you in 5 to 6, and a whole bunch of you in 6 to 10. And another one in I've lost count. So let me close that. So here are practices. We encourage you to think of 5 or fewer questions. We're not thinking of the questions like name and address, but I think some simple questions about what will you do, why is this needed, what will result, how much will it cost, and how can the foundation help, I think are the key questions that you need for discernment. I'd recommend trying to ask people to submit 2 pages or less, although I'm not a real stickler on the number of pages, but at the McElroy Trust, we had a 4-page application for a long time, and we learned that took people on average 10 hours to complete, and we had a very low approval rate. So in 1 year, we calculated that we spent about 1,000 hours of community time having people apply for grants which they did not receive. That was 1,000 hours they couldn't spend helping people in our community. So we switched to a 1-page application, and that included for big grants of $1 million, although they often ended up with site visits. And we were able then to drive the time of applying down to 2 hours. So that, that's 8 hours per organization is a really big difference. And so when you're thinking, I want to know more, I think saying to yourself, but I also want people working in my community. The time that they have to take to answer my question is time they cannot spend helping somebody. Where do you weigh that balance? So try to stop asking so many questions. I think sometimes asking a lot of questions actually distracts a grant committee from what's most important. And so I just encourage you to try to ask a little bit less, not because it's not important that you know, but we can never know everything about our grant seekers. So how do we find out the most important things and use our discernment and our trust to make choices after that? So I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to close us out. This last one is about asking for a lot of extra attachments. We're also not a fan of that, but I'm going to, in the interest of time, move on to Shannon, who's been rethinking about their grant making work. Go ahead, Shannon.
Thank you, Stacy. I was also a grant seeker before I was a funder, so I understand exactly what you're saying. If you were the one person that kept answering that there were too many to count, that's where we were. So call me. We can all. I made a few notes here, but a lot of it is stuff Stacy's already mentioned, so that's exciting. We can all be guilty of doing what we've always done and not making it's easier to keep going that way and not researching a better way. But last year we reviewed our process as we were going, and questions came up like why do they need that, or stapling this. Somebody asked me to put in their denial letter that next time they should staple their 6 copies together, and I was like, no, because we know that not because it's just how they've always done it, and it wasn't following the exact process. So we, in the effort to treat everyone as our customer, which in our case are donors and grant seekers, treating them the way we'd want to be treated. We're a small group and we wear many hats. We wanted to be flexible, build relationships with these people, And so by doing that, we got rid of a lot of the rules. And I gathered information from all of the applications that I saw on the ICOF site. I've researched many of the community foundations applications. I took our application and we went through a process of taking all the restrictions off because we felt like that was limiting the information that we were getting, and it was because people weren't applying because they were afraid they wouldn't qualify, and they didn't want to do something they shouldn't do or waste time. So we really wanted to build relationships with our grantees, and doing that through engagement, talking to them, and adding site visits. We also removed anything that we didn't need or that we don't use. There were questions we had on our application that had just been there forever, and do nots that had been on there forever that no one could really say why we didn't do that. So that's one of the reasons we took everything off that we didn't need on the application. Limit it down to about 5 questions that are meaningful to us. The key thing with the questions and the evaluation tool, it has to be meaningful. And then I went through a second time and I softened all the words. I took out all the require, and I made sure that the wording spoke to them as if we were, speaking to a friend. So I think most importantly, we gave them the opportunity to tell their story and feel listened to, because as a nonprofit, we all want that and it makes us happy. And so we also added the word count. That was a good question, good addition. So we're really excited about this, and we feel like it's really going to help our process. We don't have 6 copies of paper to go through for 8 funding cycles that we'll go through this spring. It was a lot. So thank you very much for letting me share.
Shannon, I think people are going to call you, so I hope you're ready for that.
That's great. I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I think probably everybody that spoke up today, you're doing such great work. So I hope your colleagues reach out to you and share and take on those examples. Shannon, I think that was, your language about how we talk to a friend. I really love that. I think that's the absolute principle that we're trying to get across in this, is that people who work hard in our community and seek our money are, the important part of the equation, like our donors are. And I love, maybe if we retitled this, it would be treat everybody like your friend. I think that's really lovely. And I really commend you for the hard work to start over with the process. I think that's an excellent way to go about it. So we'll close up today reminding you about these practices. I think Carrie might be willing to stay on the line and take a few questions as well. I also, since we're out of time for a lot of questions, I also suggested to Carrie that maybe we could take some of the questions and respond in text and send those out as an email to follow up, since we didn't have time for so many questions today. So I think the principle here is align your values, your principles, and your practices. So if you're saying we're here for this place, right? We're here for Hardin County, and we're here for Boone County, and we're here for Mahaska County, that's our value. And so in principle, we think about how do we connect with all of the folks who are also here for our county. How, those folks that are sending in those grant applications are people that also are here for your county. And then how do we turn that into real practices that honor our values and our principles? As Shannon mentioned, we took a couple of ideas for her. So if you're excited about what you heard today, we would suggest you find a couple of other folks on your committee or your advisory council or your grants committee and talk about these ideas. Share the handout, share the slides, tell them to check out what Shannon and Nicole and other folks are doing, and Tam. Gain some agreement with your advisory council that it might be time to shift. We've done a great job in our first 15 years in this first chapter, but it might be time to look at some new approaches. Work with your grant committee to start from scratch. We totally took that from you, Shannon, to think about start at 0 and what do we really need. Make a list of the changes you're considering, and then we want you to go back out to grant seekers and ask what would change. So if you say, what if our application looked like this? Take that back out to some grant seekers and get some feedback on that. So don't just try to launch a new perfect application. We really encourage you to be able to go and get some feedback about that. And then you don't have to do it all at once. Pick 1 or 2 things and make those changes this year. I see Tam and Carrie both nodding at that. And I'm going to sign off. I actually needed in a room next door. I'm going to sign off, but I'm going to leave the channel open for Carrie. It has been a pleasure. If you need me, Carrie knows how to find me, or you can find me at our company, seewhatimean.com. I am super pleased to be back with you and can't wait to see all of the great things that you continue to do. Carrie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Stacy. Those of you on video, we can give Stacy a round of applause here. Excellent dialogue this morning. So appreciate all of the peers who shared what this really looks like in practice. I wanted to offer a quick reminder that the Iowa Council of Foundations, really in partnership with the Affiliate Liaisons Network, put together a guide to effective grant making. And many of the lessons that we talked about today are in this guide. And I think it's just a really helpful tool to reinforce some of these points, especially with your boards, your advisory committees, and the folks serving on your grant committee as well. So please use this resource. I'll share the link in the follow-up resources, but we also have plenty of hard copies available, and we'd be happy to mail you some. So if this is helpful to you, please let us know. And I'm happy to continue answering questions, but I know we are definitely out of time. In fact, we are over. So feel free to submit them here in the chat box and we can follow up in writing, or feel free to send me a note directly. I would also remind people, as Shannon shared, there's lots of templates and examples that already have been collected and live on the Iowa Council of Foundations Knowledge Center on our website. So if you'd like to access those and maybe can't remember how to log on, please let us know. We're happy to get you connected to those resources. Or if you log on and you can't find something that you're looking for, please remember that a service we provide is our colleague inquiries, where you can share a question or request that we collect sample templates. We compile those and then share them back with you so you can use them to inform your process and your work. So just a friendly reminder about those two things. Another reminder is that we have another upcoming webinar on February 27th. And that is a continuation of some conversation we have had about the role community foundations play in preparing for and responding to disaster and natural disasters in their communities. We know that this has been happening in many cases more frequently throughout the state. Many of you experienced flooding last year, and there's some research and predictions that the flooding will be returning again in 2020. So we invite you to join us for that conversation on February 27th from 2 to 3. We'll be hearing from Nancy Beers with the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. The session is titled Disaster Philanthropy, Looking Back on Lessons Learned and Preparing for the Future. So you'll hear from some community foundation leaders right here in Iowa who played a role in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery, and they'll share their lessons learned with you. And you'll also hear about some of that research from Nancy, so you can really be prepared for what may be to come in this coming year or in the future in your community. So invite you to join us for that. You can register on our website, and we will be sharing several resources, as I've mentioned, as well as a recording to this webinar. If you'd like to share it with other members of your board or your advisory committee, please do so. We'd love for everyone to hear these important lessons that Stacy shared with us this morning. Thanks again to our peers who joined us and shared great, helpful information. And I think we'll go ahead and sign off and wish everyone a great afternoon and rest of your day. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.